and how that might relate to takings, what some higher standards might be, considerations of natural beneficial functions in the streams, and also you have to always be aware of other permits that are needed and your responsibilities as a floodplain manager in ensuring that those have been obtained. So why would we want additional regulations? Well, in Colorado, first of all of us have been required to adopt model ordinances that follow the Colorado Water Conservation Board rules on stormwater. So if you've adopted the CWCB rules, congratulations. If you apply for CRS, you already have enough points to be a Class 9 community. But that's the first bullet. You have to have higher standards than the bare minimum FEMA standards just to comply with state requirements. Can also mitigate adverse impacts to existing properties, preserving the function of the floodplains, and just an additional level of protection from flooding. You know, keep in mind that that GIS line on the page is just a model estimate of the 1% chance flood. It doesn't take too much imagination to see how that could deviate. You know, a large tree falls and blocks a culvert, and all of a sudden your model is completely gone for that roadway. So just bear in mind, it's always good to have that extra level of protection. So as this slide illustrates, even if we follow all the current standards, so imagine this original floodplain here may not have floodway delineated. Maybe even if it does, it only has floodway delineated from here to here. So this property owner comes in here, places all this fill, and has narrowed the floodplain. Now to pass the same flow past that point, he's now raised the base flood elevation even above his fill. Now, you know, a little asterisk here, as we talked about yesterday, when you file for a letter of map revision, and hopefully the community would have required him to get a conditional letter of map revision because, well, maybe that's only 0.9 feet, so he didn't have to. But now he can't certify that he hasn't caused an impact to an insurable building. But the bare minimum standards would have allowed them to do that. You know, no floodway, he's not filling in the floodway, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing to consider in this is not only has this potentially, well, not potentially, absolutely increased the base flood elevation in the immediate cross section and upstream of this area, it's also potentially increased the frequency or the magnitude of flooding downstream, because all of this overbank area here that's now fill, well, guess what that was in the 100-year flood previously? That's storage. You know, that's water, or that's area that the floodplain has to fill, or the river has to fill before that amount of discharge continues downstream. So higher standards prohibiting this kind of activity helps people both upstream and downstream and immediately adjacent to the site. So what are the principles of no adverse impact? Well, it's where a community manages development where we're avoiding negative impacts anywhere in the watershed. Like I said, upstream or downstream. The ecosystem of the stream, the health of the stream is one of the ANAI principles. And, you know, the real key that should ring in everyone's hearts is it protects the property rights. So what are the pros and cons of additional regulations? Well, the advantages we've already talked about, providing additional protection for the neighbors. You get, when you go above and beyond, you get higher credits in the community rating system. The cons are there's an economic impact, sometimes perceived, sometimes real. And if you go too far with your regulations, they can be perceived as a taking. So what is a taking? By the Fifth Amendment, states have to, or the Fifth Amendment states that no property shall be taken for public use without just compensation. So it doesn't mean you can't take it, but you have to go through compensation, potentially even condemnation to acquire that. And taking has come to mean more than just acquiring the property. If a property no longer can use their land, or an owner can no longer use their land in a way that they thought they could, that can be perceived as a taking. But most of the NFIP criteria are performance standards. They don't prohibit development of a floodplain site, provided the standards are met. Regulatory standards that are reasonably tied to the hazard and support public objectives should be upheld. So that's quotes right out of the handbook that you all should have downloaded by now, or will download to use as your study guide. The Illinois Supreme Court, in fact, found that prohibition of new buildings in the floodplain was held acceptable because, quoting, while buildings could be protected, the residents would be surrounded by moving water during a flood, and emergency vehicles would not be able to reach them. So again, you can adopt a standard that says on this piece of property that's now been identified as floodplain, you can't construct buildings. So state regulations. States can require that their communities adopt higher standards. Colorado has these kinds of riverine standards that are more restrictive than the NFIP. So the CWCB rules that are required statewide. What are some examples of higher regulatory standards? So location standards, you can prohibit any construction in highly hazardous areas, or you can prohibit critical facilities from floodplains outright. You can require critical facilities having additional freeboard. You can require setbacks, etc. Adopt higher standards for manufactured homes. It's one thing to say, well, a manufactured home has to be anchored, but maybe you adopt standards that say, you know what, we find as X community that it's not in the public interest to even allow them in the floodplain in the first place. That's a higher standard than the base FEMA requirements. Some of the building requirements, I just mentioned freeboard, the strength of the foundations that are required, mentioned critical facilities a minute ago. Encroachment standards, you can say that this fill cannot, or this structure cannot encroach into the floodplain at all, as we talked about in the Illinois case a minute ago. Compensatory storage, if as I mentioned in that one slide showing the cross section, when you place fill in the floodplain, it has an effect on downstream floods. So you can require that maybe you allow fill in one area, but to offset that, there needs to be some grading elsewhere in the floodplain, in the immediate area, in the same elevations as what's been removed. If someone places fill all the way or well into the floodplain, but then they only do compensatory storage a foot or so below the base flood elevation, Well, they've still increased the flood elevation in the 5-year, the 10-year, the 50-year event because there's no compensatory storage at the lower flood elevations. Again, on the CRS front, there's new regulations coming out that if you want to be a Class 8 community or higher, you have to adopt a 1-foot minimum freeboard for all new or substantially improved residential construction. Again, a higher standard because the minimum requirement for FEMA is that it has to be above the BFE. So 0.01 feet, 1/8 of an inch above the BFE meets the standard. But if you're a CRS community, you're going to have to adopt this higher standard by your next cycle visit. Environmental protection measures can also be adopted. There's federal regulations, the various items there you see, on-site sewage disposal in rural areas. What are your regulations going to be for septic fields in the floodplain? Or we don't do these anymore, but if a larger facility wanted to site facultative lagoons in the floodplain, is that a good idea? Well, probably not. We'll touch on some of these others. So preservation and restoration, these are not mutually exclusive. And you don't even in your regulations need to distinguish between the two. They do go hand in hand. But preservation strategies, reserve the floodplain that's there. You're not confining it. Restoration strategies, those focus on what can you do when you already have a degraded floodplain to restore some of the functions there. We have a reach of stream in our community that's had severe incisement. Basically, the upland areas are disconnected from the low flows, and instead of a riparian habitat, we've got a gulch and dead grasses. So we're looking at ways to restore that channel, create low water benches, recreate a riparian habitat. That also helps with the flood conveyance, but it also makes a healthier stream. So other permits that'll be required, if there's historical facilities in the floodplain, or if a historical site may be disturbed by a proposed project, you need to coordinate through the State Historical Society on that. Wetlands and even channel modifications need permits from the Corps of Engineers. Endangered species, and then floodplain mapping always needs to be coordinated with the state. Federal regulations you have to be aware of. The NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, requires evaluations of the environmental impact of a project. If you're going for a federal review, which a letter of map revision is, or even a conditional letter of map revision, you have to document that you have done a NEPA review. For federal agencies, these two executive orders, or certainly the second one there, a federal agency, and this would even go to the Federal Highway Agents Administration, cannot do a project in the floodplain unless no practical alternative exists. So can that roadway be built a little higher up in the valley so that you're not filling in the floodplain? crossing the river, not too many practical alternatives. Wetland protection by the other executive order, again, with federal involvement, you have to demonstrate that it's not practical to not fill a wetland area. So these are all regulations you have to adhere to that are above and beyond the basic NFIP standards. Historic structures, they get a pass on a lot of enforcement of floodplain standards. The National Historic Preservation Act reference there established partnerships that if a state agency has declared a site historical, then the federal agencies will recognize that. There's grants available to map these out or to do studies and document the historical sites as well. Some of the regulations that historical structures would be exempted from would be substantial damage regulations, as long as you restore the historical function of, or you maintain, I should say, the historical character of the site. Wetlands protection. This is probably one of the more well-known federal regulations when you're working in or near waterways. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, discharge of dredged or fill material into U.S. waters. So the 404 is not just wetlands. It's anything in the stream. So you can have a flowing stream, enough velocity that wetlands haven't established, you still can't fill that without a 404 permit. You can't impact it without a 404 permit. And the 404 extends to adjacent wetlands, and that's where a lot of the discussion on 404 permits really centers. Endangered species, we have our friend the Preble jumping mouse there. Your undeveloped floodplains provide a lot of good habitat. They may be the only place left that some of this habitat exists because of all the development around them. Federal agencies, as noted in the second bullet, cannot undertake or assist projects that would adversely affect an endangered species. So they cannot approve a conditional letter of map revision that will show an adverse impact to an endangered species. Now, I'm sure there's ways to work around that with mitigation and so forth, but again, just compliance with this is above and beyond basic NFIP requirements. There's also the NPDES system for a community, the MS4 permits, municipal separate storm sewer permit that we have with the state that feeds into the NPDES requirements. So it controls water pollution, regulating point sources that discharge into a stream, a higher standard than just basic NFIP. Now, streams can also get special designations. There are streams in the state. I didn't go and look at them to give you good examples. I'm sure trout fishermen would be able to tell you, but if you designate an area as a wild or a scenic river, that might prohibit pushing a county road or a highway through there. It might prohibit putting a bridge across that reach of stream if it detracts from the wild or the scenic nature of it. So that's the end of the slides there, but one of the things I wanted to bring up, so let me figure out how to end my slideshow here. So in the manual, when it's talking about higher regulatory standards, are you able to see my screen still?
Yes, we're
okay. Good. Yeah. So this is again page 207 out of the book, but it quotes right out of CFR Part 60. You know, as the local floodplain official, here's what you should consider when you set up your regulations. You know, permit development that's appropriate, acceptable social uses of the land, does not increase danger to human life. If you suffer a flood, so maybe you have developments that happened in the 1960s, 1970s, or much less before that. You know, people didn't look at floodplain regulations as significantly back then. Now you've suffered a flood. Okay, before you reconstruct, what are you going to do for preservation? Are you going to relocate people out of the way? Or are you going to let the channel 58 microphone stick in the person's face and say, we're tough folks, we will rebuild? How many times have you rebuilt? This will be our third time. Well, community, maybe you should not allow that. So the regulations require that you consider those things. It doesn't say you must do them, but it's shall consider. And then in your goals, you shall consider at least the following factors. Human safety, of course. Diversion of development areas to areas that aren't flood prone, and so forth. I won't read through the whole list, but I just wanted to highlight that. I don't remember when I took my test 12 years ago if these were on there, but might be a good place to bookmark in your manual. So with that, I will wrap up my portion of the presentation and stop my share and open it for questions.
Yeah, if anybody has any difficulty unmuting themselves, let me know in the chat.
Okay.
I do not see any questions coming in.
Okay, it looks like Diana's shared with the folks a link to the manual, so good.
Okay, if there are no questions, let's.
Well, Pam put an interesting one out there, and
Okay.
maybe this is a good one for Diana since it's her native backyard. Is New Orleans allowed to continually rebuild because of the historic nature of the area? I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, they are. But they still try, what the city still tries to do is if they can mitigate floodproof, something like that, they try and get that activity done. But typically with all the historic buildings that are down there, they are not subject to any substantial damage requirements. Most of the buildings down, particularly in the French Quarter, are on the historical register. But there is buildings throughout the city that are in that listing. So no, they are not required to do substantial damage. But they suggest that if something can be done, like floodproofing, things like that, that they'll look at that.
Hey,
Yeah,
Diane, one other thing I might and you know the city better than I do, but it's my recollection that a large portion of the city actually isn't even in a special flood hazard area because of the levees. Is that a correct statement?
That is correct. And even
Yeah.
on their new maps that were issued 2 years ago, they reduced what floodplain was there to mainly streets. There may be a little overflow into the communities, but a lot of the floodplain was reduced.
So regardless of how you all feel about the flood risk in New Orleans, if a lot of the city is not actually shown in a special flood hazard area, then the floodplain regulations as we know them would not apply to those areas.
Correct.
Yeah, I just, I saw this last night, and I'm going to give a shout out to Dave Skoudas from the Flood District. He does a lot of writing that's fairly insightful. So hopefully the link went through correctly there. He wrote an article that talks about the cost of constructing very constrained stormwater channels, floodplains, and not only the cost of the initial construction, but when that infrastructure has to be reconstructed down the road. Have you even recovered enough through your local taxes, and the flood district gets property tax that they then turn around and help agencies with maintenance of streams. But have you recovered enough? You created enough room for a 7-Eleven at the edge of the floodplain by putting up walls and channelizing it. Did you recover enough sales tax from that 7-Eleven to pay for the reconstruction of those improvements down the road? So it's an interesting article. I highly recommend it. Like I say, I don't necessarily follow Dave on all the various platforms, but I do occasionally see some of his articles, and this was a very good one. So.
All right, thank you, Jim. I'm going to stop recording now.